He drained the water from a radiator once, just to heat up a pot noodle. That's the same man who became World Darts Champion at 28, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a world champion ends up there and what happened to him after. Richie Burnett went from the top of his sport to depression, addiction, and financial ruin, and decades later he's still throwing darts for a living. Here's what actually happened to him. Wales gave darts one of its loudest, most unmissable characters when Richie Burnett came up through the British Darts organisation in the early 1990s. Fans and commentators remember the walk-ons, the celebrations, the temperament that made him impossible to ignore on stage, and two nicknames stuck with him for the rest of his career: the Prince of Wales and the Welsh Wizard. Those weren't just throwaway titles either, they followed him through television broadcasts and fan footage for the next 3 decades, and even now, well into his 50s, people still call him the Prince when he walks out to the Oki. 1994 brought his first BDO World Championship final, and John Part beat him there. It was a good run, but it wasn't the trophy, and for a lot of players, reaching a world final and losing would be the highlight of an entire career. For Burnett, it turned out to be a warning shot. A year later, the same stage produced a different result. Burnett returned to the Embassy World Championship final in 1995 and beat Raymond van Barneveld to become world champion, and just like that, a player from Wales was the best in the world. It's worth sitting with that matchup for a second, because Raymond van Barneveld would go on to become one of the most decorated players in the history of the sport, and in 1995, it was Richie Burnett standing across the Oki from him with the trophy on the line, and it was Richie Burnett who walked away with it. The story didn't stop there either. 1996 brought a third straight World Championship final, and this time Steve Beaton took the title away from him. 3 consecutive finals in 3 years, with a win sandwiched between 2 losses that stretch from 1994 to 1996 is the peak of Richie Burnett's career, and everything that came after gets measured against it. He also reached the World Masters quarterfinal that same year, 1996, adding another line to an already stacked resume. 3 world finals in 3 years is a record most players in the history of the sport never come close to touching, and Burnett did it before he'd even turned 30. Darts had split into 2 rival organisations by this point, and many of the sport's biggest names were being pulled away from the BDO toward the newer body, the Professional Darts Corporation. Burnett made that same move, following the money and the competition to where the sport was heading. 1997 brought an exhibition against Phil Taylor, billed as the Battle of the Champions, a matchup between 2 of the most recognisable names darts had at the time. By 2000, he'd reached the World Match Play quarter-final, where Rod Harrington ended his run. A year after that, in 2001, he was part of a match against Keith Deller at the Circus Tavern that people still talk about, the kind of match that gets pulled up and replayed by fans decades later. The 2000s and into the 2010s kept him at the top level. Wales sent him to the World Cup of Darts alongside fellow Welshman Mark Webster, and the pair played together against Croatia in Hamburg before facing Poland and Australia in 2014. The same year, he was still a regular fixture at the PDC World Championship. That's worth pointing out on its own, because staying inside the World Championship field for that many years, across 2 different decades, is not something every former champion manages to do. A lot of players win a title and fade out within a few seasons. Burnett kept showing up. Something was going wrong underneath all of it though. Dartitis crept into Burnett's game, a condition that leaves a player unable to release the dart properly, and for someone whose entire career depends on a smooth, repeatable throw, that's close to catastrophic. Picture standing at the Oki in front of a crowd, arm cocked, and your own hand simply refusing to let go of the dart on command. That's what Dartitis does, and it doesn't care how many world titles you've already won. His consistency went first, and his confidence followed, and by his own later admission, life away from the stage was falling apart at the exact same time. This is where that radiator story comes back in. Fellow player Mark Webster has said he personally watched Burnett drain hot water from a radiator to make a pot noodle, and Burnett himself has since put it more bluntly, admitting to what he's called idiotic overspending during those years. Whatever the exact details, the picture from people close to him is consistent: a former world champion who'd gone from the top of his sport to serious financial trouble. Somebody who once held the biggest trophy in darts was, by his own account, dealing with money problems serious enough that people around him remember specific, almost humiliating details from it years later. There was also an on-stage confrontation in 2012 at the Players' Championship Finals involving Adrian Lewis, a moment that circulated widely among fans and added to the sense that Burnett's career was becoming defined as much by turbulence as by talent. 2015 is when it caught up with him. Burnett tested positive for cocaine at a PDC Grand Slam qualifier in Wigan, and the punishment was an 18-month ban backdated to November 2014, which kept him off the tour until May 2016. Sky Sports News and BBC Sport both ran the story as major news at the time. A former world champion banned from the sport that made him famous over a failed drugs test. That's not a small headline in the darts world. This was a man with an Embassy World Championship to his name, suspended from the sport entirely. Burnett later opened up about what he'd been dealing with during that stretch. At the 2019 Red Dragon Champion of Champions, his words were direct. "I've always been a loose cannon, but I just made a mistake, and I've learnt by it." In later interviews looking back on his career, he's talked about depression and personal issues weighing on him during that period, describing the drug use less as partying and more as a way of escaping what he was going through, and he's apologised publicly for it since. A lot of players never come back from something like that. A world champion undone by injury, money trouble, and a ban that made headlines, that's usually where the story ends. It wasn't where Richie Burnett's story ended. May 2016 brought the end of the ban, and instead of disappearing, Burnett dropped down to the Challenge Tour, several levels below where he'd competed as a world champion and won 2 events there that year just to start rebuilding. Think about what that actually meant. A man who had once beaten Raymond van Barneveld in a world final was now grinding through lower tier events just to prove he still belonged on a dartboard at all. 2017 brought Q School, the qualifying grind where players fight for a PDC tour card. And Burnett won his card back by beating Paul Nicholson, a former world champion in his late 40s, grinding through qualifiers just to get back on tour. Q School is brutal, even for young players trying to break through for the first time. For a man in his late 40s, with a world title already behind him, going through that process again says something about how much he still wanted it. The years after that kept adding to the resume. A 9-dart finish came in the Online Darts Live League, a clip that ended up being watched by roughly 78,000 people online. A reminder that even in the twilight of his career, he was still capable of a perfect leg. He won Group 7 of the Championship League darts by beating Gary Anderson, one of the best players of the modern era, in the decider. Back in 2013, he'd already beaten fellow Welshman Mark Webster at the UK Open, proof the results weren't just nostalgia. He also kept his own signature equipment out there through Red Dragon darts, 25 gram, 90% tungsten darts carrying his name, a small detail, but one that shows he stayed a commercially relevant player, not just a name from the history books. The UK Open in 2023 gave Burnett his deepest run in a PDC major in roughly a decade, and the win that got him there carried real weight. He beat 2-time world champion Peter Wright to reach the quarterfinals, 28 years after the two of them had first met on the biggest stage in darts, that 1995 BDO World Championship final. 28 years is a long time between two meetings, and the symmetry of it, the same two men, one match deciding a world title and the other decades later in a UK Open, is the kind of detail that darts historians point to when they talk about his career. Dimitri van den Bergh eventually ended the run in the quarterfinals, but by then, the point had already been made. Burnett could still compete with the best players alive. Around that same run, he summed up exactly where he stood in his career. "I'm getting to the twilight of my career, but I can still play. At your peril, don't underestimate me." That quote turned out to be more than just talk, because the years since have backed it up. None of that led to retirement. 2024 and 2025 saw him competing on the World Seniors Dart circuit, reaching the quarterfinals in 2025, and he stayed a regular name on the Modus Super Series as well. This is worth slowing down on, because a lot of former world champions, once they hit their late 50s, step away from competitive play entirely and move into commentary booths or exhibition-only appearances. Burnett hasn't done that. He's still entering ranked events, still playing best-of-legs matches against active professionals, and still reaching the later rounds of those events. January 2026 brought a long-form sit-down on the Tops and Tails Darts podcast, where he talked openly about a difficult childhood and about the darting stars and characters he'd grown up watching in the 1980s. The episode took its title straight from something he said in it: "I'll carry on playing until the day I drop." That interview matters because it's one of the most recent times Burnett has spoken publicly. and at length about his own life, not just his results on stage, and it gives a rare look at how he talks about his own career now, decades removed from that 1995 title. By April 2026, he was giving interviews as part of an Australian tour ahead of the Sydney Darts Cup, which means he's not just playing domestically in the UK anymore. He's being flown out, interviewed, and promoted as a headline name on the other side of the world, more than 30 years after he first picked up a set of darts professionally. On top of that, a Darts Mafia exhibition featuring Burnett is dated for June 2026, which means he's still touring, still doing exhibitions, still playing in front of crowds, still being booked as a draw. Put all of that together, and here's what his current schedule actually looks like. Ranked senior tour events, Modus Super Series appearances, international exhibition tours, and podcast interviews, all happening within the same 12-month window. That's not the schedule of a man coasting on his name from 30 years ago. That's an active playing and touring calendar for someone about to turn, or who has just turned 59 years old. Look at the whole arc and it reads like this. A world champion at his peak in 1995, sandwiched by finals losses in 1994 and 1996, followed by a slow unraveling through dartitis, financial trouble, and personal struggles that ended in an 18-month ban in 2015. What came after that is the part people don't expect. Challenge Tour wins, a tour card clawed back at Q School, a 9-dart finish watched by tens of thousands of people online, a Championship League Group win over Gary Anderson, and the 2023 UK Open quarter-final where he beat a two-time world champion nearly 3 decades after they first shared a stage. Richie Burnett is still out there right now. Still playing, still touring, a world champion who fell about as far as a player can fall, and who's still the one saying he'll carry on until the day he drops. That's where Richie Burnett stands today.